Hello again, and thank you for hanging on until the afternoon and after lunch. My name is Oana Popescu-Zamfir. I'm director of Global Focus Center, which is an independent foreign policy and security think tank in Bucharest, Romania. We deal a lot with disinformation, malign interference, and regional security. So I guess that's the reason I'm today's moderator. The other reason is that somebody needed to be in charge with hopefully keeping this an interactive debate. And we promise that despite the fact that we are quite a lot of us, we will do our very best to keep this going as a conversation and not just a series of monologues. For the sake of brevity, I will just ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and just in 1 minute to state what is their relation to today's topic, how their activity relates to disinformation, and with a focus on the Eastern Partnership countries, if any. So let's start with the ladies. And Veronika, if you can please introduce yourself.
Thank you. So my name is Veronika Wisla. I work for the European Values think tank, which is based in Prague, in the Czech Republic. In 2015, right after or shortly after the annexation of Crimea and after the war, start of the war in eastern Ukraine, we established a program called Kremlin Watch. And the reason for that was because we started to notice more and more disinformation, especially in the Czech online space, sort of connected to those issues. Since then, our activities broadened quite significantly. We are not only monitoring, fact-checking and countering disinformation themselves, we also very soon realized that they're often connected to other tools of interference of domestic affairs like political corruption, like politically motivated economic operations, support for far-right activists, for example. One of our main goals is not only to describe the problem, but also to suggest solutions, which is what we have been doing for the last 2 years at least. We are proposing recommendations for government, civil society. We are organizing trainings, briefings. We try to advocate for measures that we think should be taken against disinformation, especially if they are coming from an external adversary.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Angelina, to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Angelina Gross-Czerweciska. I work in the European Commission in an entity which is called Security Union Task Force. It helps coordinate the work in the Commission and External Action Service on security, which covers different aspects. But I'm on the panel because since last year we have been also coordinating the implementation of the action plan against disinformation. This is a framework which brings together the activities of the European institutions and the member states. And it's based on 4 main pillars. One is improving capabilities to detect, analyze, and expose disinformation. Then developing coordinated response via what we call the rapid alert system. Then we have engagement with the private sector via voluntary, for the moment, engagement of a code of practice where social media platforms commit to ensure a certain level of transparency and fight disinformation. And finally, many awareness-raising initiatives which improve the societal resilience to disinformation. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we can elaborate on one or the other of the actions later.
Thank you. Well, my name is Vato Maharoblishvili. I am a Deputy Foreign Minister of Georgia. Well, first of all, of course, I really want to use the opportunity and thank the conference for including Eastern Partnership in one of the topics. I think it's very important that BLED also discusses Eastern Partnership, and especially when it comes to disinformation, since I think Georgia as well as other countries in our region are on the forefront of disinformation. Therefore, I may not be an expert as some of my colleagues at the panel. I represent the ministry, the government, but I represent the country who had been historically, unfortunately, having a very rich experience in disinformation and in general addressing hybrid threats and hybrid warfare. So I'm really happy to be here and be part of the discussions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Roitman. I'm the spokesperson at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and European Integration of the Republic of Moldova. Due to my activity on a daily basis, I encounter fake news on what means foreign policy of Moldova. It's linked, as usual, to European integration, relations with NATO, bilateral relations. So kind of every day we have the possibility to see false narratives which undermine our foreign policy, and this is the cause I'm here, because certain experience has been accumulated with fighting this phenomenon, explaining to the people our foreign policy, explaining false narratives, and trying to be proactive in order to make people understand what are the priorities of our foreign policy, and dismantling the myths. Also, I'm a member of the board of European Digital Diplomacy Exchange, which is a platform which brings together diplomats who communicate for different ministries and governments through the world. So it's kind of Balkans, several EU countries, and Eastern Partnership countries. Also, the final word would be that many of these narratives we need to combat in our daily work. They are on a regional basis. So it's the same for Ukraine, it's the same for Georgia, it's the same for Moldova. Different narratives appear, and we need to dismantle this. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Eli Nalanga-Yonatamishvili. I represent the NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence in Riga. And it's not disinformation. We indeed are accredited by NATO, but we are not part of NATO command structure. So we are a small international organization of our own. In terms of disinformation and the Eastern Partnership countries, so a lot of our work is related to research and trying to understand how information influence campaigns are built and executed. So disinformation is a part of it. We've done work on Ukraine, also Moldova, together with local researchers. Now we are doing a project with Georgia. We've also done quite a lot of research on inauthentic activity online, so on social media, like we do our regular robot trolling report. So yes, disinformation is part of what we research.
Dobar dan. My name is Mark Vlasic. As far as background, I started my life as a soldier in the United States Army, then went off to work at the UN War Crimes Tribunal on the Milosevic case and the Srebrenica genocide case, came back to the States and wound up working for the White House and the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates at the time, where obviously during that time there was a strong interest in information warfare issues. From there I went to work for Bob Zoellick at the World Bank doing asset recovery work, helping track down money from past dictators, and now split time between teaching at Georgetown University, working in private practice, and more recently I'm a television producer in Hollywood. And so my range has started from kind of the hard side to the Hollywood social impact television side, working on a new action adventure series, think Indiana Jones meets James Bond, which hopes to do what the movie Blood Diamonds did for Conflict Diamonds, but for conflict antiquities, to use the media to put a bigger spotlight on challenges, thereby hopefully impacting the marketplace for stolen treasures from the Middle East in particular.
Thank you. And, you know, I've already gathered a few important issues that you have somehow introduced here. And they match the fact that as a think tank, we at the Global Focus Center, we have been focusing not just on what we call the supply side, which is what others do to us, but on the demand side, which is what is it that we don't do enough? What are our vulnerabilities in the social, political, economic, foreign policy field that can be exploited by malign actors? And we do insist on not calling this just disinformation, but malign interference, indeed, of all sorts and through various means. And you have highlighted here a few major issues. I will quote just some. One, that there is not just disinformation, that there are political means, that there is economic interference, that there are multiple ways through which you can interfere in the stability of a state and society. The other one, that there are recipes, or perhaps not recipes, perhaps there are spontaneous phenomena. I think that's something I will ask you about, that are not just limited to one country, but they're regional. There's stuff that happens in one country and then you can find it in another. And I wonder if this is something that's coordinated or if it's a spontaneous phenomenon. Also that there are internal and external factors. So there's perhaps state disinformation, and then there's non-state disinformation within the borders of a country and outside the borders of a country. And the other one, that there's, some of you have mentioned that you try to counter disinformation, and others have mentioned that you also try to gain the upper hand and put the alternative narrative out there. Now, the first thing I would like to ask you, and I have discussed with all of you and said let's move beyond contemplating the problem and let's focus on the practical aspects. Disinformation is here to stay. We know that by now. But what are the forms that you witness in your practice, in your countries? And can you share with us if you think these things that you're faced with are, as I was calling them earlier, spontaneous phenomena? Is it that the world has changed? Is it something new? Do we have a social, the social fabric changing because of technology and communication? Or is it just a new form of aggression and a new form of, let's say, conflict? So whoever would like to provide an answer to this, please do so.
If I could just kind of open with an initial thought on that. Peter Singer is a writer in Washington, D.C. at the Center for New American Security. And I think the way he's looked at this is, we're used to cyber attacks, trying to hack into your computer system. I think the difference in this modern age now when it comes to information warfare, it's not a hack into a computer system, it's a hack into your mind. It's trying to change the way you view things based upon the information, slightly, oftentimes, taking the truth, pushing it a little different perspective to try to have you reanalyze something in your mind and to reinforce ideas that might have already been placed there by others and to keep that process going. And so I think for the broader kind of response to that, it very much is not just a whole government response, it's a whole society approach. Everyone needs to do their part, whether it be from government, from platforms, to actual society, through education, what have you. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think the panelists here are so committed to kind of changing this whole society approach.
But does this come from the fact that society itself has changed in some way in recent years because of internet, because of social media? Because I guess that also gives us a glimpse into how we deal with this. Do we have to come up with new methods ourselves because this is a new reality? Or do we already have the methods? Is democracy just the same? Human rights are the same? Civil liberties are the same? We just need to apply the same concepts to somebody's new idea of how to hack into our minds.
I would put a general question is how much of digital we want in our life. The fake news, disinformation is not something new. We say that it's from 15th century and it continues today. The only thing which changed is that the method which false information gets to us, and it gets to us mainly through digital. After the elections in Ukraine, some specialists started to talk about phygital. Phygital, it's a form of interaction of physical and digital. So how real are things? So someone who watches us now on TV, how real is it for him that we stay in this room, and how real is it for those who stay here? So how digitalized the world becomes, so how much digital we want to have. And people have a very good question, what changed in our society? People have no patience to read very careful news. People don't have possibility to check the news so good. So we have a new normality, new reality in the digital world, which we should somehow settle in. We have, I thought about an example. We have a Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, consular relations. maybe we should have Vienna Convention on Digital. So certain rules should be applied all over the world. Why not? Maybe it's an idea to discuss.
That would be at the level of governments. You can constrain governments to sign up to that, but not necessarily citizens. That's debatable. Elena, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question. So what is different these days? I guess what we are facing is psychological warfare, which is intensified by social media. And like in old days, one of the best ways how to wage psychological war but was by using human networks to create rumors. So these days, the same thing is happening, but through social media. And it's now such a wide network of peer-to-peer information, and there is much higher level of trust than there is between, you know, the citizen and the government, or the citizen and what we call like traditional mass media. So this is basically the problem. I think this eroding trust and the growing trust in the peer-to-peer networks on social media that enable these spread of rumors and disinformation, basically. So in order to verify something, I'd rather go to you and ask you on Facebook or WhatsApp, rather than actually go to official news sources or look at some government statement. So I think this is one of the problems. And then we have to talk about the roots of why this trust is eroding.
Just to also reflect on the question, I would say that, of course, there is nothing new about it, because disinformation has been there, I mean, throughout decades, and coming from the country who had been part of the Soviet Union. Of course, we had been disinformed about the rest of the world for many, many years. And what has changed, of course, is we are living in a digital world, in a world when the media technologies are being have been advancing very rapidly. Therefore, I mean, the information distribution is much more rapid, with various technologies like bots, trolls, other means. Therefore, of course, the hybrid warfare and the disinformation had become one of the powerful instruments among state actors or non-state actors in terms of course, achieving their goals. And of course, it is very much true when one says that, you know, today you can win the battle or the war without firing a single bullet, with all the hybrid warfare instruments that one can get. And of course, disinformation is one of the very, very powerful instruments among them.
Angelina, but let me just also throw something else into the mix, and ask you, perhaps you can include in your response, what is it that worries you at EU level the most? Is it the orchestrated campaigns, the voluntary disinformation, or is it this eroding trust which creates fertile ground for perhaps also involuntary disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the purposes of our panel, we define disinformation as something which is intentional and coordinated, right? The rest we could call it misinformation. But I wanted to perhaps to build a bit on your first question, which is linked again to, in a way, information disbalance. Because of the way information is reaching people today, it is, there is a certain filter that is applied. And the question is, I mean, this filtering can be intentional or could be applied for other reasons, as we know, for advertising, but the final result might be the same. It is that when you base a decision, which could be as innocent buying something and as serious as voting for a party, what's important that you have at your disposal the full scope of issues that are at stake, as opposed to a selection which is presented to you because of a way an algorithm is designed. And therefore, I think a very important element of fighting disinformation is also engaging all social platforms, but other private actors, to make sure that we provide transparency. Because this is in fact what is needed. When you see a certain information, to know who has paid for it, why do you see it, and to base your judgment on this.
So do you mean the kind of instruments that will label a source as being trusted or reliable or non-reliable, or what kind of instrument do you think people can be offered that would make it easy for them to make that decision?
Yeah, I mean, for example, some of the steps that signatories to the Code of Practice on disinformation, which I mentioned earlier, were encouraged to take. I mean, just for those that you are not aware of, the Code of Practice is voluntary commitment by advertising industry and social platform. Currently, we have Facebook, Twitter, Mozilla, and Microsoft that are signatories. And ahead of the European elections, they were requested to introduce a number of measures and report monthly on the progress of the implementation. Among them was, for example, transparency of political advertising. So if you go on Facebook, you see a political advertisement. There is a button you can press and see why do you see this advertisement, who has paid for it. And there is also at database which goes 7 years back, and it is verifiable. So for every political campaign, you could see who paid for it, and of course, obviously, also why are you seeing it concretely, and it has chosen, the algorithm has chosen to show it to you. Other measures were the removal of fake accounts, or also fighting other unauthentic behavior online.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, to respond to your previous questions about the difference, or what worries us more, the orchestrated campaigns or our own vulnerabilities, local actors spreading disinformation, I think you can't really divide one from the other. It is, in a way, a vicious circle. Obviously, technology today makes it much easier to manipulate, and it makes it even more cheap and even profitable. But the methods of manipulation are not new. They have been used before. I think one of the biggest differences when I compare current disinformation campaigns to, for example, Soviet propaganda during the Cold War is that today ideology doesn't really play a role, or at least not that significantly. When I look at producers of disinformation, they're not trying to persuade us to believe one specific thing. They're trying to create an environment where anything is possible, where we are fed with so many versions of events that we are then distrustful to mainstream media or to traditional sources of information. We're distrustful of democratic systems and institutions, of democratic politicians, and then we are sort of inclining to get information from alternative sources. So when there are debates led about the solutions, and I feel like very often we're discussing whether we should build our resilience and close the gaps and our own vulnerabilities, or if we should defend ourselves in a different way, be more proactive, maybe even put a cost on the adversary. And the truth is we have to do both because we are being attacked on many fronts, and we have to respond adequately.
Thank you. And Alex, I would ask you, how do you feel in your daily activity when you struggle against fake news and disinformation? Do you feel that you're up against a concrete enemy? Do you feel that there's someone behind attempts to manipulate public opinion? Or do you feel that you're actually fighting a state of mind phenomenon?
It feels like all together, but coming from several examples, we had to fight concrete things. So not all the times it comes from foreign sources, let's say. So first of all, it's the current political debate in the country. So we have different political entities that see things differently. And I would come here with an example. We had this ETIAS appeared in the European Union, the special mechanism to provide irregular migration and so on. And it was perceived by local press as a threat to the free visa regime for Moldova. So we were explaining like 5-6 times in the year, 1 year, from different levels, from the prime minister to the minister, but the narrative persisted. So it was exploited in some political means. This happens. So this would be one situation. Another situation when you have some foreign actors which have a certain interest to destabilize a little bit the situation before, for example, elections. Elections are the best case when you can spot different narratives linked with, again, EU integration, cooperation with NATO, bilateral cooperation with countries, for example, for us is Romania or Ukraine, our neighbors. And it could be in this way also. Sometimes it's just fake news because somebody did not check the info or did not check with you. So everything happens in this digital, very digital era. So it's very important from my point of view, it's very important to make the media monitoring. So when you spot the news, you should contact the respective journalist or newspaper, and the many of times we had, it works okay. You explain to the journalist that this is not how you understood it. This would be the what I wanted to say here, and coming to the Facebook thing. So in our case, maybe colleagues will say how it appears in their countries. In our case, Facebook became as an official source. So for last 3, 4, 5 months, nobody is sending links to the press from websites, official websites, but just from Facebook, and it became very fluctuant. So I liked very much how Facebook worked on the EU Parliament elections. And we also had a case in Moldova. So before the elections, Facebook deleted 168 accounts, which, how Facebook calls it, they say uncertain activity, and 28 pages which were delivering different political messages which were changing the set of mind of the electorate. So the challenge here is that Facebook is a very good tool to work, to spread the information. But again, the set of rules on political activity should be activated, and the possibility of verified accounts, I think Facebook should work more on that to identify people who are politically active and who can prove their identity. Because today, our real identity with our digital identity can be different. So I can be, my name could be Fyodor, for example, in Facebook, but in real life I'm some another person. So I think we will come to that when our digital profile will correspond with our real profile, and then maybe it also will be a less source of disinformation in this case.
Thank you. And Vato, I will turn to you as the other practitioner. I know that Georgia has perhaps one advantage, and I will ask you if this is an advantage. It has clearly identified its enemy. It's been under attack in every way by Russia, and also according to our own studies, it sometimes helps if you are at least able to clearly identify your enemy, then it allows the establishment to develop the adequate response. But my question is beyond if you think this is true and if this has helped in some way. Do you also feel that there are internal forces that don't have the Kremlin behind them, but whose agenda aligns with the Kremlin's in various ways? And are they harder to fight than the enemy that you know?
Well, yes. I mean, actually, you're quite right. I mean, it could be said that it's a certain advantage, because I think when you face disinformation, the first thing one should do is to identify the source. And in Georgia's case, but I think not only in Georgia's case, but in many country's case, especially in Eastern Europe, the source of disinformation is Russian Federation, and the target is, of course, foreign policy, as well as identity policy. In fact, one of the messages coming from the Russian side is always that the Western values are not compatible with Georgian culture or the values that are in Georgia or in our neighborhood. Therefore, I think there are many other, of course, targets policies in the toolbox, but these are the two main things. And of course, there are groups also in the country. It could be political parties, it could be civil society members, some NGOs, or some media outlets. Of course, there are some Russian media outlets like Sputnik Georgia, for example, which is in Georgian language, but also some other outlets also in Russian language, which of course, talk with the same narrative. And there are some groups, be it NGO or political parties, who just follow the Russian narrative and, of course, are pro-Russian, forces, although they are marginal in Georgia. But, of course, there are some other cases when the narrative that comes from a Russian side on a specific issue may coincide with the interest of the certain group in Georgia for a certain period of time. I mean, those roads will then split, but at some period of time, because of some policy issues within Georgia, and target groups are mostly more radical right groups or more radical leftist groups related to migration issues or some other issues, which could be which could be of the same page with Russian Federation. So it differs. I mean, it is of course the advantage that you know the source, and once you know the disease, then you of course you are better positioned to find the cure for the disease and come up with relevant instruments. And of course, we can talk about relevant instruments later on. But at the same time, I would also confirm the fact that these narratives sometimes coincide within the country with some groups, some with pro-Russian, but also with some who, in a specific given time, have a similar policy with regard to the specific issue.
Okay, if I can jump on that and build on that comment. It's interesting because just a few weeks ago, I was having coffee with a friend who is a former national security official who now works for one of the major platforms in the United States. And I said, what's the big challenge coming up? And he said exactly what you said. He's like, it's easier for these, it's not easy, but these major platforms are getting better at identifying foreign sites who are trying to influence domestic campaigns. He's like, the bigger challenge will be exactly what you said, finding individuals that have a common alliance with an outside source, where that outside source is feeding those individuals material that they're then happy to use themselves, which serves both that individual's purpose and the foreign government's purpose as well. And it's going to be much harder to deal with those issues because of the overlaps with freedom of speech and what have you, because they're effectively agents of that foreign power in the domestic society.
I mean, sometimes there doesn't even need to be a source that actively feeds that information because they're copycat crimes, so to speak, even in this field. But so we've basically heard about the responsibility of platforms, and that's clear. I mean, since social media is such a major element in this, clearly clearly the big platforms have a role to play. But who are the other stakeholders? So who needs to do something about this?
Yeah, I was just listening to other panelists and thinking about because we were talking about basically disinformation that is designed for political military influence, basically. So that's the motivation. And of course, at the other end of the response, the key responder is the government trying to secure the democratic processes and protect the interest of its citizens. So we don't have a panelist from Ukraine here, but I just wanted to use the now President Zelensky's campaign as an example of how the government, okay, they were not government at the time, but like how political forces or also governments could actually embrace technology instead of talking of, oh my God, how it's all being used for disinformation and by these bad actors. Well, let's be better at using it ourselves, because I think, for example, one of the things that Zelensky's campaign in the pre-election period did, they actually crowdsourced using social media identification of disinformation cases about him as presidential candidate. And so he used technology to just engage people to identify disinformation and tackle it before it became a problem for his campaign. And they were quite successful in that. Also, how this, you mentioned about the narrative, like how governments try to project and explain their narrative to the citizens, and still these malign actors somehow manage to play at the fears and hopes and still distort the picture. So I think one of the problems is also how we don't adjust our language to the new technologies and social media that people are mostly on these days. So if you try to talk to me about the deep, comprehensive free trade agreement, just tell me, new jobs, prosperity, money, that's what I understand, more food on my table, yeah? So we have examples from Winston Churchill. I think he would have been perfect on social media, he just said, let's hold hands, that's what we are all about as allies, So I think we have to more talk about also how we can utilize social media and technology, not just that it's something that the enemy is using.
The thing is, we're talking about governments as if these were a beacon of hope. But the thing is, trust in governments all across Europe is at an all-time low. Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. And not to offend anyone else on the panel, I would personally be very much afraid if my government got even better at using technology to project narratives that are very often toxic. And now, at the risk of offending some on the panel, in Eastern Partnership countries, actually, very often governments, not necessarily those of the present time, but historically, have been part of the problem more than the solution at many times. So the thing is, how do we balance? I mean, on the one hand, platforms are non-accountable. I haven't voted for the CEO of Facebook or Google or anyone, so I don't want them to bear responsibility for what kind of information reaches me. I have a problem with governments as a citizen. How do we balance these things?
Be brief on this. No, I mean, I think that, it's good for the governments to be able to identify the disinformation, as we said, analyze and debunk it. But I mean, the whole system cannot simply rest on the government. For me, it's an issue of each individual citizen, and I think we should invest much more of informing people at all levels, starting from schools through universities, civil society organizations, so that they are able themselves to look critically at information, because they will never be ultimate institution that is able to check every possible source. So I think we should just try to empower, for starters, a lot of researchers. Some of them work in the organization like yours, that are able to identify disinformation and basically offer some positive narratives next to it. And then focus on training people how to identify it. Because that's the only way for me to counter it. A bit like this inoculation theory, right? We show people this information, how it works, and then they're much less likely to catch it and look at it seriously when they see it.
Yeah, I would just build up on what was said by the colleague. I mean, it was also mentioned that, of course, transparency, traceability, inclusiveness are things which are crucial in this process. And of course, this kind of builds up what was said, that one agent like government or media could not really, or civil society separately cannot deal with the issue. There should be inclusiveness and more engagement with each other from the government as well as civil society, as well as media actors in this direction. And of course, one issue which is extremely important is education. Education of media literacy, one issue, very important. I think media should be, I mean, in our countries, I mean, especially media is becoming more and more active, pluralistic. I mean, there are a lot of media outlets, but it is also important that these media outlets are higher, I mean, more educated in terms of identifying what is information and what is disinformation. But also it is important to educate regular citizens when it comes to the critical digestion of the information they receive, and this should be part of the DNA, and it should be taught probably in the schools in terms of processing the information one receives, because it has become such a big problem.
I'm going to play devil's advocate, and I take two issues with what's been said. One is, so basically you're giving me reason to be optimistic some 20 years from now, because education is long-term, and it's absolutely necessary, but it's going to take forever. I mean, we've been discussing that we needed critical thinking in our education systems at least since the fall of the Iron Curtain in this region, and it still hasn't happened. And then the other issue I have is with the fact that, again, in this region, multiple media sources doesn't necessarily equal pluralism of views, because very often those media sources are owned by oligarchs or anyway have very non-transparent relations among them. So, I know you wanted to jump in, Veronika, but I will ask you if perhaps, or if anybody else afterwards also thinks that there is a role for media, for traditional media to play, and if we can strengthen that, because I don't see that as being a healthy actor in this region.
I agree with you, especially with your note on education. I believe that media literacy and digital literacy is extremely important, but we can't rely specifically on this because, like you said, the results will be seen much later, which is why I think that even though government isn't the only actor that should be doing something about it, that it's still important that the government is a driver of the agenda. Especially in the first place when it comes to acknowledgement of the problem itself. There is still a lot of European countries where the governments are denying anything such as any problem like disinformation even exists, or even are using disinformation themselves for their own interests. And in such a state of play, it is very difficult for civil society to do anything about it. So governmental acknowledgement of the problem and prioritizing it is a very important first step. There is a role for parliaments, which can, in some more difficult cases, investigate different influence campaigns. There is a role, obviously, for NGOs, especially when it comes to expertise, fact-checking. And yes, I think traditional media should definitely do a better job to provide reports, to provide reporting that is going to be not only objective, but also attractive to the readers. They are the ones who should use technology maybe a bit better to reach out to their target audience. I'm not saying that journalism is altogether in decline, but there are obvious gaps because you see people consuming very, they call themselves alternative media, alternative sources, which are often very bizarre, but what they do well is giving the consumers what they want. They provide infotainment, like in the case of RT. They use platforms very well, and they're very good at their target group analysis. And I think that traditional journalism is sort of falling behind there. And the second reason is that they often are a little bit, I don't want to say that they're not objective, but they are often also sort of focused only on one or very narrow point of view, which I think is really losing a battle for the type of audience which is sort of in the middle somewhere, undecided. So we should do that job much better. And I think that, trainings for journalists and connecting journalists with civil society experts who understand this issue is one of the ways how to move forward as well.
So I've been thinking about other solutions, and I think a very obvious one to me is language. Because if we look at the Eastern Partnership countries and also at the Baltic states, for the generation that is 50 years and older, for them actually the only foreign language that they know is actually Russian. And if we know that a lot of disinformation campaigns actually come from Russian language sources, what happens is that if a person comes across a piece of information, even if they bother to double check or look at other sources, whatever comes up is also in Russian. And what they witness is the information laundering process, where, this piece of disinformation is just spread and reinforced, creating an impression that, yes, everybody is writing about it. So if there was, so obviously I'm not saying that now in a year or two we can teach all population English or German or French, but what I'm saying is that certainly we can do that with the new generation, but we can also maybe somehow help and subsidize from government side actually translation of foreign sources into the local language so that it's available for people. Also, language is a problem when it comes to detection of such malign activity. So there are a lot of commercial companies walking around and trying to sell their services, and they say, oh yeah, we have this list of potential suspicious sources, and now we're just going to press one button, and this program is going to run its algorithm and give you like early warning about any kind of disinformation campaign and stuff like that. So what happens is that these systems, of course, work very well when you have a lot of material to train them on, like with any sort of machine learning programs. In Georgia's case, for example, it's a unique language. There is nothing else in the world. They have a unique alphabet. So, I mean, if these salespeople come to the Georgian government and try to sell these programs, I mean, obviously they're not going to work very well. Same with Latvian language. So, it's a unique language. So, I mean, at least our alphabet is not unique, but so this is the aspect that we have to consider very much, I think, language. And there are some practical solutions that we could implement right now.
On that topic, there's a scholar in University of Canberra named Dr. Mike Jensen, who's kind of a leading thinker on these issues. But one of the things we were talking about earlier, and I was smiling at your comments regarding infotainment, is, I started my life as a lawyer, as a prosecutor. And so for me, my life has very much been based on facts, and I love footnotes and citations and that kind of stuff. I recognize through my now new life in Hollywood that I am not normal. Most people do not like those things, and they don't get excited by footnotes and citations. And it's been a struggle, to be honest, between us friends. As the person who's helping create a TV series which is inspired by truth, i.e. stuff I've done in the real world on kind of stolen treasures, but taking that kernel of truth and turning it into a fun narrative. And I think this drives to your point that when you're trying to entertain people, particularly in on broadcast television with a major network, with Amazon as well, is you want people hooked. You want people to believe in the story. And I think that's very much rooted in the fact that we as humans are storytellers. Our first stories were not things that were written down. They were shared over and over again through word of mouth. It is core to our society that we tell stories. And frankly, as we've learned through kind of modern technology, the best stories are the ones that are more sensational, more exciting, more tantalizing, or titillating, as sometimes people say. And so when you come out and say, these are just the facts, people are like, fine, tell me more about the story. This sounds great. And I think that's the big challenge we have to do. And again, to your point, I think it's another aspect of governments and leaders in governments. It's as the president of Finland who stood up and said, this is a national problem. We all have to do our part, but we also have to do a better part of telling our collective story. So this fun story that is more easily spread has some other story that we can actually really believe in.
Just 2 words about from the government standpoint also, because I think we are very serious about strategic communication and disinformation in general already, but I think we should get even more serious, and because it is not PR, it is something different, and I think governments in every country should treat it in a more even in a more serious way, having relevant units, departments in every relevant agency with a better coordination as well. But also what is extremely important is cross-border cooperation, because disinformation is something which doesn't have any borders. Therefore, I think the cooperation, better interaction, sharing of information is extremely important. Since we discussed Eastern Partnership, I think it is extremely important to enhance cooperation among Eastern partners, and there are relevant platforms for that, but also with EU, NATO, other major partners, with East Stratcom or NATO Center of Excellence or Helsinki Center of Excellence on Hybrid Threats. I mean, these are the agents with whom we should do more. I mean, the work is in progress, but I think if we want to achieve good results, we need to better coordinate and have a better unity on these kind of issues.
Thank you. And Alex, I'm going to unveil the fact that you mentioned to me last night that the current government in Moldova has been more proactive in communicating. But building on, what Vato was saying, that they're taking disinformation very seriously, I wonder, do you feel that institutions in general take information just as seriously? And do you feel that on the other side, because you have to work with journalists, you cannot work with Facebook accounts, do you feel that you have journalists on the other side who are willing and able to be receptive to your message? Do you feel that journalists in general are a professional category that is sufficiently, well off and open-minded and educated, so that all you need is to just put the message out there? Or do we need to work with that category as well?
I will start with that. That is a very good question. How should I put it? So, first of all, politically, we should understand that it's a very polarized media situation. So you have those who sympathize with left or right. You have those who try in this situation to stay, and they do it to stay very professional and to give the news, not try to interpret it. But I must say that we all the time, as a ministry, as the government, we work with all the journalists, so we don't separate them to categories, colors, and so on. And in most of the situations, we have a good interaction with press, and there are no situations that some messages are definitely not taken from the government. But again, in this polarization, you have different actors which play in this media field as they feel to. And you mentioned that there are some owners of some media outlets which have certain interests, not to coming very deep into the political things. Also, here I would say that we don't have so many journalists who are very specialized. For example, that journalist is on foreign policy, that one is on sport, that one is healthcare, and so on. So our partners help us with the development of media, press, making different trainings for them, and it brings up the level of journalists, but the environment is such that a journalist makes all the stories in one day. So in the morning he could write about sport, in the evening foreign policy. So sometimes we experience this, that colleagues from press do not feel quite well the subject, but this is solved by supplementary discussion. I wanted also to bring in the discussion what was told before, that what should governments do, what should media do. There are sort of tools which are useful, I would say. So we have EU vs Disinfo on the EU level. In my country, we have a Stop Fake website, and there was a very interesting story. So when they spot a false narrative, they make an article about it, they expose it, they send it to all media outlets. And before the election campaign, we had the situation that a website, Stop Fake, appeared, which was copying the real one. So
it was a fake Stop Fake.
Yes, and a Stop Fake page on Facebook. So it was very, very, very difficult to understand which is real and which is not. So just carefully reading what it is, you could understand which is the real one. And they couldn't do anything because it was a foreign server. But now the problem is solved, and I want to say that we work closely with them. So, for example, when I spot a false narrative, I send the information to them. They prepare it. And an idea that I got yesterday speaking with colleagues, does anyone know from which year we have on television weather forecasts? So it's 1930. And I was thinking, why we believe in weather forecasts? It's normal. We have news, then we have weather forecast, then we have sports. But why don't we have a rubric of anti-fake news, for example? Every television could have 3-5 narratives presented which are false. So maybe people who look at us now could think of it. Thank you.
See, many people consider debunking and exposing fake news as a way of solving the problem, and I mean, I have strong issues with that, not just because doing what you say would give extra exposure to the fake news, but also because my question is, how do we regain the upper hand? Because every communication specialist knows that once a story becomes viral, no matter what you do, and how you fact check and expose the story as being fake, you're not going to reach as many people as the first story has reached. So my question is, how do we regain the upper hand? And because I want to open this to the room, I will ask you, Angelina, because EU versus Disinfo has been mentioned, but this is again a debunking unit, and I would be more interested to know, especially since Eastern Partnership countries don't necessarily probably have the resources to either invest in quality journalism or improve the general communication environment all by themselves. Is the EU doing something, or does it plan to do something as part of the agenda with the Eastern Partnership countries to either help improve the media environment or help them actively regain the upper hand in the fight against disinformation?
I can just start by saying that, of course, I mean, the banking is one side of the issue. The other is providing the positive narrative. I mean, you said that a big chunk of the disinformation is about the EU-Moldova relations, for example, or relations with other Eastern Partnership countries. And then one way to go is to debunk the concrete fake news, let's say, but the other is simply to push much more information in a, I don't know, user-friendly manner or in an easier, understandable way to citizens without necessarily going against the concrete negative narrative, but presenting what, in fact, this cooperation offers, giving examples that are linked to everybody's life on the ground. And I mean, going back to supporting independent media, I know that there are several projects in both countries that are presented on these panels, both supporting civil society organizations or I think media monitoring initiatives. Also, the work that is done at local level then feedbacks to EU versus Disinfo, and then it is also then distributed to other member states. So I think there is quite intense cooperation on that. But if I can add at this point a leftover from the previous discussion, because it is partially linked to the positive narrative. So one thing is, let's explain better what actually good we are doing, as opposed to trying to debunk the fake news. And I want to go back to the point that we should make it everybody's responsibility. I agree that it will be difficult now to make a plan and educate, introduce media literacy at all stages of the education system. But I mean, using what you said about targeted audiences, we can at least start doing it at the key points of where we expect disinformation search, like before elections, and then focus it to key stakeholders. I'll give you an example. For example, before the European elections, in some countries, there were sort of trainings for candidates and journalists on disinformation, how it's spread, and it was in combination with also cyber attacks. Okay, I don't want to open yet another chapter here, but I mean, in essence, most of the disinformation is a cyber-enabled activity. So it was perceived by everybody to be quite helpful to train both the candidates and the journalists, so they have this awareness when they go into the campaign together. The same applies to the part of the citizens who are most exposed. I know that you have done some studies in some of the countries in the region, but for example, if we identify that the most exposed groups are, for example, people over 50, let's say, or the very young, then we could design media literacy I don't know, activities or campaigns specific for this audience. And in any case, we have to start from somewhere. So.
I have to admit that listening to you, I'm thinking maybe to a large extent it's just a matter of scaling these measures. I know that in Romania, for instance, very few people actually attended the trainings that were offered. Google, for instance, was rather sad that they came out and offered candidates a whole host of instruments, and very few were actually receptive. But it's kind of sad that years after disinformation has become a massive threat to all of us, we're still kind of thinking of what we could be doing, and somebody does a little bit of this and somebody does a little bit of that, and I feel that we should be much more advanced. But let's open this to the audience, and I see a hand up already, so please, any questions? Do we have a mic? Yes, we have a mic. It's coming.
Oh, great. So Andras Raj is my name. I'm from Hungary, though soon leaving the country, but that's another story. I would like to have a theoretical question here. People in military science often teach that one needs to think with the heads of the adversary, right? What is the calculus of our adversaries? What is the calculus of the disinformants who are exercising disinformation? Their calculus seems to be zero positive. If disinformation works, fine. If disinformation doesn't work, we try another narrative. So the ones who exercise disinformation actually do not risk anything. They do not face any costs. For them, it's for free. If one narrative doesn't work, they try to use again another one. So the question is it possible to raise the cost for the disinformants? Is it possible to make their operations more costly? Thank you.
Question. Who would like to take it?
I think that is a very important and good question, one that isn't really discussed enough. So I will talk about, again, about the Russian influence, Russian disinformation, or Kremlin's disinformation, because that's what I'm focusing on. And I think exactly European countries had put almost no cost on the adversary for their activities. There are economic sanctions, but unlike the United States, we haven't been really escalating them after any following incidents. And there are several measures that we can do. When it comes to Kremlin's proxies in our countries, we can always expose them, investigate them. That itself is a problem for many of them, the discreditation. But when it comes to Russia itself, we can always use measures which only a couple of countries decided to use, like extending Magnitsky Act on oligarchs who are involved in, channels producing hostile disinformation. When it comes to economic operations, which were mentioned before, we can always establish proper screening of foreign investments. We can publicize more the wealth that comes to the owners of the disinformation channels and the Kremlin's oligarchs. We can publicize more the fact that many of those producers of disinformation and people from Putin's circle who are, promoting those narratives that Europe is in decline and spreading disinformation, have their children studying at European universities and having their villas here. So probably for them, it's not really that bad. And we shouldn't be, worried to discuss those things because they're controversial, because it really has become very, very cheap for the Kremlin to use this tool to destabilize our own countries, and we're doing almost nothing to make it more difficult for them.
Can I sort of spoil the party? So we've been all the time talking about politically motivated disinformation, but I think a very important challenge that also costs money and sometimes even lives is profit-based disinformation. So it's not with the aim to exert political influence and change public opinions, but just to earn money through clickbait. And I think in Latvia we had a very good case last year that I want to bring to your attention. And it showed how this type of activity can be very costly to the one who's doing it. So it was a guy who created slowly several portals and Facebook pages mimicking real, very popular portals belonging to entertainment TV stations, our largest news portal, etc. And he basically at one fine day decided to post the news that our biggest shopping center in capital Riga has been under a bomb attack. So it caused actually a major public panic. It of course caused real financial loss to the business owners. And at the end of the day, what we realized was that our legislation is fine. We don't need new legislation to actually take action against such people. So there is actually no need for some new kind of, digital fake news law. Our law is fine. It's just a matter of willing to apply it. And this guy was actually prosecuted. His earnings, as he was claiming, and there's no way to verify it, he was spending from 50 to 150 euros to buy fake accounts on Facebook and other social media to spread his news, make them viral, as you said. And he was earning about 3,000 euros per month just from that activity. So
I was thinking as you were speaking that Bill Browder, who's one of the biggest advocates for the Magnitsky legislation, both in the United States and around the world, would be immensely proud that this topic came up in this panel discussion. I think he and lots of folks that have been working with him relish the side of being a thorn in the side of some evildoers out there, despite huge personal risk to them. And I think these expressions of protest, whether it be from legislation like this, or frankly the cost of telling someone you can never travel to a country again. And having started my life as a prosecutor, but then went to private practice, I actually worked on cases here in Europe where I, as a lawyer, advise some Europeans, we advise you never to travel to America again. And to tell someone who thinks quite high of themselves, who likes going to Christmas shopping trips with their family to New York City, they can never come to the United States again, is really offensive to them. And whereas I think some of these characters that are perpetrating this work are not eager to go to New York, but they probably are eager to go to the Montenegrin coast, the Croatian coast, the Slovenian coast, what have you. And those limitations to their personal selves and to their families cause huge personal complications in their life. And to your point, I think it's about increasing the pain that they also feel. And I think as a side of the prosecutions, the U.S. efforts to identify actual individuals that were perpetrating some of these internet attacks in the United States is spot on. Because while they may never be let off in handcuffs, there is a social stigma that you are a criminal. You broke laws, and that there's some ramifications for that. And I think the more we're just silent and just absorb it, it's, listen, the schoolyard bully is going to keep on kicking people in the shins if no one stands up to him. And this is what we have to do, is stand up to him.
I also deliver some thoughts. So you, the two words you used is the calculus of those who disinform and the costs. We can do several things on what you asked. First of all, it's to keep the normal modus operandi, meaning being very transparent. When you become very, very transparent, it becomes difficult to those who want to disinform or to try to change your narrative to do it, as I see it. About the calculum is for sure to distract us from what we do positive, what we do from what we do every day, and all the energy goes to show the people that no, it's not like someone says. The real thing is, but in that time you cannot concentrate on your positive agenda. And the very interesting aspect that appeared here, it's how we work legislative with fake news, with disinformation. We saw several examples through the world. Somebody even said that we will interdict this channel or that channel. The practice shows that it doesn't work this way. And for example, in Moldova, we have this anti-propaganda law, which prohibits the channels which did not sign European trans-European TV, a document. They cannot show different military, political debates, this kind of shows on a local Moldovan TV. So this works in a way, but you have internet where you can find everything. So those shows which discuss political and so on. And there should be a very balanced approach, because for today I've read an example. So there is a country which prohibits, or people can be sentenced for a tweet, retweet, share on Facebook if it's under the law of, I don't know, calling to protests, mass murder or something like this. So we should be very attentive how we work with the legislation on fighting disinformation, because every law of this kind is prohibitive, and then you need to assure freedom of speech, and then you want to assure your informational space, and so this would be some thoughts on that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hello, so my name is Orban Spital. I work mostly around Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and I was just in Central Asia during the last standoff of ex-President Atambayev in Kyrgyzstan. And it was funny how I would want to shift the whole picture back to consumers of information. Nobody followed the national media, or, of course, Atambayev has its own platform. Everybody followed Telegram. There were groups on Telegram where people just, asked their friends and so on, because people had a stake in it. So when you kind of shrugged off the learning process of how to tackle disinformation, I would like to ask you to elaborate on it a little bit more. Is there anywhere that there is such a program in schools or whatsoever on a mass scale? Because if you ask me, if we're gonna have this issue solved through learning in 20 years, that sounds like a pretty sweet deal to me.
Actually, I really don't know in detail, but I think Finland has sort of addressed this already. Because you know, right? So that's one thing. But just coming back to what our colleague said, it is a comprehensive thing. So obviously, we're not gonna solve anything by just education. It is the responsibility of every citizen who uses social media. It is the responsibility of the social media platforms. It is about the partnership between the businesses and the government. So it has to be a comprehensive approach. One more thing that I wanted to add on this, I think we often forget here in Europe that there are other parts of the world where we could learn a lot from. The world's largest democracy, India, they've had some very serious cases of misuse of WhatsApp, ending in murders and lynching people. And because they are obviously one of the very big customers to big social media platforms, they are more willing to make some steps and make some improvements to their programs in order not to get sanctions from Indian government side. So actually, thanks to them, thanks to India, we now have a limited possibility on WhatsApp to spread disinformation. So we no longer can forward messages to more than 5 people, 5 contacts at the time. WhatsApp, I think, also developed some kind of a way how to mark fake news. I'm not quite sure how that works. We'd have to all Google it and read about it. But yes, basically, I think there's a lot of learning to be done outside of the Euro-Atlantic space.
So we have a program of this kind. First of all, this Stop Fake organization, they travel through the country and present examples of fake news and media literacy and so on. And also, yes, there is a course in the schools. I cannot say, I think it's for a year now already. I cannot say what are the results, but I hope it will work. And speaking about Telegram, our country's case, so I have 2 channels in Telegram. One is in Russian, one in Romanian, and they with the difference of 2-3 minutes, they present the most important news of the day, and the news are the same. The different are the accents. So someone sees more important thing in that. On that, there is no disinformation. There is just presenting the information. But again, it's a Telegram channel done by 1 or 2 or 3 people which have their optic and perspective. So I'm being pessimistic on that, but this is not.
Just to add what I have mentioned before, because again, of course, there is no one institution or agent who should be dealing with these kind of things, and it's a comprehensive issue, and it really requires inclusiveness of all the institutions and actors in the country. But of course, the tools, are different in every country, right? In some countries, television are something that is mostly watched. In some others, social networks are more used, especially, for example, take Georgia. In Georgia, Facebook is extremely popular. To be very frank, today, especially young generation, for them, the information source is the Facebook and social networks rather than any television. They don't really watch television anymore. So, obviously, you have to identify many things. You have to identify the source. You have to identify the goal. You have to identify the target. Also, those groups who are used. So, and then you have to really seek for the instruments. And in that sense, besides some of the things that I've already said in terms of departments, agencies, and cooperation within the country and outside the country, since in Georgia, the main challenge and main source is, of course, coming from the Russian side when it comes to disinformation. And in fact, the goal is, the policy is not pro-Russian, but in fact anti-Western and anti-EU and anti-NATO, basically trying to instill futility with regard to EU and NATO integration of my country. Therefore, in Georgia, what we have been done alongside many other things is that there is this big center who is actually supported by EU, but also by United States as well as the NATO, who does a lot of work in terms of meeting people in the regions, not only in the big cities, but also in the small towns, and basically bringing the information about the benefits that this integration brings to their lives and to the reforms that we undergo. There are many other projects, like we have brought ethnic groups from various vulnerable regions from Georgia to Brussels to basically educate them when it comes to EU and NATO, as well as clergy. I think this is also extremely important. Georgia, as well as some other countries in our region, are Orthodox countries, and Russian Federation is also an Orthodox country. Therefore, they also always try to use this card as Russia being a protector of Orthodox Christianity in the region. And with that card, they also bring some disinformation alongside. Therefore, bringing our clergy to Brussels, basically educating them that the West and EU is not bad, but rather, the values that EU promotes is very similar, if not the same, and in fact, it is the same. What we have in Georgia is something which is extremely important. One thing I think is to be kept in mind by all governments and everybody is that to deliver. I mean, besides debugging and besides fact-checking, it is to deliver on the results, and the gap between what you say and what you do should be very, very little, if anything. Therefore, I think result-oriented work and policy, not only from Eastern Partnership but also from the EU, NATO, and other Western partners, is something that is extremely important.
I think that's your latest remark actually refers to the good governance of a country in general, or not necessarily with the good governance, because I think Boris Johnson very recently understood that the gap between what you say and what you do needs to be very small, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. Veronika?
Right, to the education question, one more point that I would like to make. So in the Czech Republic, mostly media literacy and digital literacy is covered by NGOs, not our Ministry of Education. And the NGOs that do it, especially the organization called People in Need, have absolutely not enough resources to reach all the pupils and all the students that they need. What they started doing is educating the teachers at primary schools, at high schools, how to teach their own students media literacy. And this is extremely necessary. It was, I think just today, there was a new survey published in Slovakia which said that over 50% of teachers in primary schools would recommend to their pupils as a news source two of the most hardcore disinformation conspiracy theories website. It's scary to me. I don't think, there wasn't such survey in the Czech Republic, but I honestly don't think it would be much better. So that's one thing. The second thing, when it comes to education, a completely different question is how to reach the senior population. So the elderly are being targeted by disinformation pretty heavily. In the Czech Republic, we have been talking about technology here a lot. Do you know how elderly people are targeted by disinformation in the Czech Republic? By email, chain emails, hundreds of thousands of people. And those people have almost no digital literacy to double check any news. They usually get those emails from their friends, so they automatically believe it. And they are one of the most disciplined voters. So this is a problematic group as well. And I don't think that has been particularly solved in any country that I know of. This is still a problem we should be focusing on.
This is a very good point, because a few of you have mentioned how disinformation can be cheap and with very good return on investment, whereas there might be an asymmetry. Fighting disinformation might not be very cheap. And I'm afraid that indeed the media is underfunded, civil society is underfunded, so some of the stakeholders are not in the best position to do so. Unfortunately, we have to close soon this very interesting debate, but I will ask every one of you to just try to imagine the near future, 5 years from now, and just tell me, do you think we're going to be better off or worse off from the point of view of our vulnerability to disinformation and the how disinformation wreaks havoc in our societies. And if there's anything in particular that you think is going to change 5 years from now, for the better or for the worse. Mark, can I start with you?
So in 2006, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld made a joke that a lie can travel around the world before the truth even has a chance to put on its boots. That was a while ago, and I don't think that's changed too much. I would like to think, though, with thoughtful people on this panel working in this area, and those of you in the room working with your governments and your societies and your educators, that will somehow change. So I will remain an optimist, but we'll check in 10 years from now.
You should be a politician, judging by your answer.
Yeah, I think we will be definitely in a better place because, as you mentioned in the very beginning, this is a problem that's been talked about so much, and that's already one big step, the recognition that there is a problem. So I think that what I would like to see more actually is all the actors that are involved, and especially the governments in this context that we discussed today, take more from the research, from basic cognitive psychology, because it proves that the appeal and frequency are the ones that actually make people accept stories. So if the story is appealing, if you are the first with the story there, then the disinformer will have no place. Because the basic way how human memory works is we memorize the first story that we hear. If it's appealing to us, then we stick to it, irrespective of debunking or alternative information. So it's about being appealing and being there first and being frequent with it. So I think we're learning and we will get better at it.
I tend to be pessimistic. I think it all depends how digital we will become, how digitalization will work. If we will come to a situation like in the movie Black Mirror, I hope many of you saw it, so it will be very difficult to cope with it. And I would bring a comparison, when you are the truly one, the transparent one, and you, it's like you play football and you play by the rules of football, but your counterpart plays by the rules of basketball. So it would be very difficult to cope with that. But being also a little bit optimistic, we will do our job very committed, and we hope that we will reduce this this influence, malign influence.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll be also cautiously optimistic because I also think that there is a lot of work in progress, in our countries, but also with our partners, with the European Union and other partners. But of course, one thing that is extremely important is, and I'll go back to where I started, because as I said, the major source of disinformation for Georgia comes from Russian Federation. And Russian Federation knows what it wants. Russian Federation wants to derail our Georgia as well as Ukraine, Moldova, other countries from its reforms, from its integration with the West, with the European Union, and basically disinforms the society how bad the West is. So, and basically the goal is to restore the spheres of influence that it had in the past. So the goal is very clear. And when the goal is very clear, then you can very easily build the strategy of communication around it. What is important for Europe and the West, I think, is to really figure out what it is, and I'll also go back to our title of the panel, when it comes to Eastern Partnership. What is the goal of Europe and West when it comes to Eastern Partnership? And then, if we want to have a strategic communication, then the goal should be also political and very serious. Of course, it is extremely important that today Europe is concentrated on practical deliverables, a lot of tangible things, and we are very appreciative, and of course Georgia as well as other countries are extremely engaged in this process. But I think without a clear picture for the future, without a clear vision, long-term vision, where we want to go when it comes to Eastern Partnership, it is going to be very difficult for Europe to build substantial and productive strategic communication around it. So I hope and I have a cautious optimism about it that we should be moving in that direction. We have summits coming up in the near future, and I hope that we'll have some results in that direction. Because one thing that I would also want to mention when it comes to Eastern Partnership, because this was the title of our panel, is that Eastern Partnership is not against Russian Federation, right? Although if you look at the ministerials and summit meetings of Eastern Partnerships, EU member states especially try to come up with this narrative and persuade Russia that, oh, it's not against Russia, it's not against anybody, but it's just about the reforms, about the development of these countries. It is true. I mean, if you look at this, the partnership...
I have to pass it on to Angelina, because otherwise we're going to get kicked out of the room. But your point is entirely valid, and I clearly hope that 1 year from now when we discuss this, we will know the EU will have a clear idea of what it wants in its relation with the Eastern Partnership. Angelina?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Just say that I'm optimistic. I've been just looking at European level where we were 1 year ago and where we are now. I think there is a huge leap also, I mean, in every of the aspects, at governmental level, at media level, and at civil society level. What I want to mention at the end is the need to connect all the actors, because as we said, I mean, there are many stakeholders that are active in the field, and in fact we can save energy and amplify their efforts if we make sure that they're connected. The fact checkers could be connected to the governmental efforts. We could provide funding for the civil society to do awareness raising campaigns. So I think that now that there is a wider awareness of the problem, there is a chance, and more people are working on it, there is a chance to connect all the stakeholders, which will hugely increase our, firing power. Thank you.
I would like to point out that democratic systems are sort of vulnerable by nature and always will be, because it takes longer to make decisions in a democratic systems, because we preserve certain freedoms like the freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And obviously, many democracies in Europe are currently facing other issues and challenges that they have to deal with in the next couple of years. But it's also if you have a broken leg, it's very difficult to heal your leg if somebody is kicking you into the leg. So we need to focus on both, to cover our own vulnerabilities, but also to stop the aggressor from kicking us into the broken leg. And if we don't do that, the kicking is going to become harder and more sophisticated. Even now, it's becoming more and more difficult to attribute some of the disinformation campaigns. Recently, in Ukrainian elections, there were Russian agents offering money to Ukrainian citizens to, sell them their Facebook profiles to sort of confuse the audiences. The good thing, the positive, the optimistic thing is that we already know a lot about foreign influence and disinformation, about its impact, about its tools. We even know what can be done about it. We just need to do it. We have a gap in action. We have to stop looking for one magic solution, and we have to sort of have a comprehensive strategy on all fronts to deal with this problem.
Thank you very much for to all of the panelists for this debate, and I think my own optimism will clearly increase if 1 year from now at the next BLED Strategic Forum, when we have a similar panel with the same topic, we will be debating more of the what have we done that has already worked, what have we done that hasn't worked so much, and we will go beyond just sort of praising ourselves for finally beginning to acknowledge the existence of the problem, which although I fully agree that it is an achievement, because 1 year ago we would have probably been even farther behind. I think, again, if 1 year from now at the next strategic forum we'll be debating more of the solutions that we've tried already, that's going to increase at least my own optimism significantly. Thank you again to all of you, and thank you to the audience for bearing with us and for being interested in this topic. I think this is a key part of coming up with solutions. So thank you again for a wonderful debate.